The massive hall of the Galactic Council sparkled with crystalline lights, its high ceilings decorated with moving holograms of distant stars. Tom Miller adjusted his chef's coat for the 100th time, his hand shaking slightly as he arranged the carefully prepared dishes on the presentation table. Around him, other human chefs were doing the same, each one chosen to represent the best of Earth's culinary traditions. "Remember," said Ambassador Wilson, her voice tight with anxiety, "this presentation could make or break Earth's standing in the galactic community." She smoothed down her formal diplomatic robe, her eyes scanning the growing crowd of alien representatives. Tom nodded, trying to stay calm. After 50 years of preparation, Earth had finally achieved the technological and social requirements for joining the Galactic Council. Now, following ancient tradition, each new member world was expected to present their culture's finest achievements. Earth had chosen its food. The first alien delegates began approaching the Earth section. Their forms were diverse, some tall and willowy with iridescent skin, others short and stocky with multiple arms, and a few that seemed to float rather than walk. Tom stood proudly behind his signature dish, a perfectly prepared beef bourguignon, the meat cooked for 12 hours until it was tender enough to cut with a spoon. A tall, elegant alien with silver skin stepped forward. According to the translator badge on Tom's collar, this was High Counselor Reed, one of the most influential members of the Galactic Council. Tom's heart raced as the alien lifted a small portion of the dish, using their eating utensil. The reaction was immediate and horrifying. High Counselor Reed's silver skin turned a sickly gray. The alien's eyes widened in what could only be disgust. "What manner of barbarism is this?" the translator crackled. "The proteins are denatured through crude application of heat. And these flavor compounds, they assault the senses." Tom's stomach dropped. But the sauce took 3 days to prepare," he stammered. "The wine, the herbs." "Wine," another delegate interrupted, their tentacles curling in revulsion. "You deliberately allowed fruit to rot, and then added it to your food. And these herbs, you added plant defense chemicals for flavor." The situation only got worse as more delegates sampled Earth's offerings. The sushi was declared dangerously unprocessed. The carefully aged cheese was described as intentionally spoiled milk. Even the fresh bread was criticized as unnecessarily complex carbohydrates, contaminated with expired fungal spores. Tom watched in dismay as his fellow chefs faced similar reactions. The spices in Indian curry were labeled as toxic. The fermented kimchi was called actively decomposing vegetables. Every single dish that Earth had proudly presented was rejected with increasing levels of horror. Ambassador Wilson tried to salvage the situation. "Perhaps we could explain our cooking methods." "Cooking?" A blue-skinned delegate cut her off. "You mean the deliberate application of destructive heat to perfectly good nutrients. We abandoned such primitive practices millennia ago." By the end of the presentation, Earth's reputation was in shambles. The Galactic Council granted them membership, barely, but with a stern recommendation to advance beyond their dangerous food preparation methods. As the human delegation packed up their rejected dishes, Tom overheard 2 aliens speaking to each other. "Can you believe they actually eat that way? Indeed, how have they survived this long? Their whole planet should be classified as a contamination risk. The planet of inedible foods, that's what we should call it." The return journey to Earth was quiet and tense. Tom sat in his cabin, staring at his prized chef's certification, feeling like his entire life's work had been judged and found wanting. How could he have known that the galaxy's advanced civilizations had evolved beyond traditional cooking? That they considered Earth's cuisine not just primitive, but actively dangerous? As their ship approached the familiar blue marble of home, Tom made a decision. He wouldn't give up. There had to be a reason humans had developed these cooking methods over thousands of years. They weren't just random or primitive, they had purpose. He just had to figure out what it was. He had no way of knowing that in a few months, His primitive cooking knowledge would become the galaxy's most valuable treasure. 3 months after Earth's culinary humiliation, alarm bells rang through the galaxy's most prestigious space station, the Grand Meridian. The station's medical bay was overwhelmed with patients, all showing the same mysterious symptoms. Dr. Alan Gray looked at his datapad with growing concern. In the past week, the number of cases had jumped from 10 to over 1,000. The patients lay in their beds, their bodies growing weaker by the day despite receiving the best nutritional supplements the galaxy had to offer. Another 20 cases just arrived from level 3, his assistant reported, her face drawn with worry. Same symptoms. They can't absorb nutrients from any food. The standard nutrient pills aren't working either. The doctor walked through the crowded medical bay, looking at the patients. Rich merchants from the trading sector lay next to maintenance workers from the lower levels. The disease didn't care about status or species. He stopped at the bed of his first patient, a wealthy food critic who had once written a scathing review of Earth's primitive cuisine. The critic's normally pristine scales had dulled to a sickly shade. "Please," they whispered, "I haven't been able to eat in days. Everything passes through me without effect." The station's council called an emergency meeting. Representatives from every major medical center in the galaxy attended via hologram, their faces showing various signs of stress. The situation wasn't limited to the Grand Meridian. Reports of similar cases were coming in from across the galaxy. "The outbreak appears to have started in our most advanced sectors," one medical expert explained, pointing to a holographic map dotted with red warning lights, particularly in areas with the highest concentration of modern food processing centers. "But that's impossible," another council member argued. "Our food processing is perfect. Every nutrient is extracted, purified, and delivered in its most efficient form. There can't be anything wrong with the food itself." Dr. Gray studied the infection patterns. Something about this felt wrong. The most advanced worlds were hit first and hardest, while some of the less developed planets showed few or no cases. It went against everything they knew about disease spread. The situation grew worse by the day. Travel between systems was restricted as planets tried to protect themselves. Food shipments were quarantined and tested, but nothing showed up in the scans. The galaxy's most advanced medical equipment couldn't find what was causing the illness. Panic began to spread faster than the disease itself. People started hoarding food supplies, even though the regular food wasn't helping the sick. Markets crashed as trading routes were closed. The galaxy's carefully organized systems began to break down. In his lab on the Grand Meridian, Dr. Gray worked through the night, reviewing test results. He had tried everything in the standard medical procedures, but nothing worked. The patient's body simply refused to process any nutrients, no matter how perfectly prepared and balanced they were. He sat back in his chair, exhausted. On his desk, a small screen showed news from across the galaxy. A report about food riots on one of the core worlds. Another about a luxury restaurant chain going bankrupt. And then, almost missed among the crisis headlines, a small note about Earth's continued use of unsafe food preparation methods. Something clicked in his tired mind. Earth, with its primitive cooking, its dangerous fermentation, its crude processing, had no reported cases of the disease. He quickly pulled up more data. Other worlds that hadn't fully adopted modern food processing showed lower infection rates. The connection was there, but he couldn't explain it. What did these primitive worlds have that the advanced ones didn't? As he pondered this question, his computer chimed with another alert. 100 new cases had just been reported in the station's upper levels. Whatever this disease was, it was getting worse, and they were running out of time to stop it. In his desperation, Dr. Gray made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. He opened a communication channel and typed in coordinates he never thought he'd use, the contact information for Earth's delegation to the Galactic Council. Maybe, just maybe, their primitive ways held the key to saving the galaxy. Back on Earth, Tom Miller stood in his grandmother's old kitchen, surrounded by large clay pots and jars. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the steam rising from various fermenting containers. After the humiliation at the Galactic Council, he had returned to his roots, trying to understand why humans cooked the way they did. "There has to be a reason," he muttered, opening a jar of sauerkraut his grandmother had taught him to make years ago. The sharp, tangy smell filled the air. On his tablet, news reports showed the spreading galactic plague. The symptoms reminded him of something, but he couldn't quite place it. He picked up his grandmother's old recipe book, its pages yellow with age and stained with decades of use. Inside, beside the recipes, she had written little notes about why certain foods were prepared in specific ways. One note caught his eye. "During the hard winter of '89, this kept us healthy when nothing else would grow." Tom's hands shook as he read more. Every traditional recipe had a similar story: surviving winters, long voyages, times of shortage. These weren't just cooking methods. They were survival techniques refined over thousands of years. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Dr. Gray of the Grand Meridian Station, marked urgent. Tom almost ignored it. He'd had enough of space station inhabitants looking down on Earth food. But something made him open it. As he read the doctor's description of the plague symptoms, his eyes widened. He rushed to his computer and pulled up historical medical records. The symptoms matched almost perfectly with diseases from Earth's past, particularly from times before humans understood the importance of varied diets and beneficial bacteria. "It can't be that simple," he whispered. But the more he researched, the clearer it became. The galaxy's perfect food processing had removed everything unnecessary, including the microscopic helpers that human bodies had evolved alongside for millennia. Tom called his old friend, Dr. Maria Santos, a microbiologist. Within hours, she was in his kitchen, taking samples from his fermented foods. Her portable lab equipment hummed as it analyzed the bacterial contents. "This is fascinating," she said, looking at the results. "These fermented foods are full of beneficial bacteria that we now know are crucial for nutrient absorption. Your grandmother's recipes created perfect environments for cultivating them." Tom thought about the aliens' reaction to Earth food. They called our fermented foods rotting. They thought adding bacteria was primitive. Primitive. Maria laughed. "These fermentation techniques are incredibly sophisticated. They create complex microenvironments that support exactly the right kinds of beneficial organisms while preventing harmful ones from growing. It took our ancestors thousands of years to perfect these methods." Their discussion was interrupted by another urgent message from Dr. Gray. The situation had worsened. Even the most advanced medical facilities couldn't help the victims absorb nutrients anymore. Tom looked at his grandmother's recipe book, then at the lab results showing the rich bacterial cultures in his fermented foods. What if that's exactly what they need? Not more refined nutrients, but the helpers that make those nutrients available to the body. Maria ran more tests, focusing specifically on how the beneficial bacteria interacted with different types of nutrients. The results were promising. The same bacteria that helped humans digest food might help other species too. Tom started packing samples of various fermented foods: sauerkraut, kimchi, yogurt, and more. Each one contained different beneficial bacterial strains. He also packed his grandmother's recipe book, filled with its generations of wisdom. "You really think the galactic plague could be solved by Grandma's fermented cabbage?" Maria asked, helping him pack. Tom thought about all the times in human history when these foods had helped people survive. "I think we've spent so much time looking up at the stars, we forgot to value what we already had on Earth." He sent a message back to Dr. Gray. "I'm coming to the station, and I'm bringing something better than medicine. I'm bringing food that knows how to heal." For the second time in recent months, Tom prepared to present Earth food to the galaxy. But this time, he wasn't going as a humble chef seeking approval. He was going as someone with a possible cure for a plague that threatened galactic civilization. The Grand Meridian Station looked different from Tom's last visit. The once bustling corridors were quiet, with only medical staff hurrying between sections. He carried his precious cargo of fermented foods in specially designed containers, each one carefully temperature-controlled. At the medical bay entrance, Dr. Gray met him. The doctor looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes. "I hope you have something useful," he said, leading Tom inside. "We lost another 30 patients this morning." The medical bay had expanded to fill 3 entire deck levels. Beds stretched as far as Tom could see, each one holding a patient in various stages of the disease. The sight made his throat tight. This was even worse than the reports had shown. "Your message mentioned something about bacterial cultures," Dr. Gray asked, his tone mixing hope with skepticism. Tom opened one of his containers, releasing the sharp smell of fermented cabbage into the sterile hospital air. Several nearby medical staff wrinkled their noses in disgust. "Not just bacterial cultures," Tom explained, setting up his samples. "These are carefully cultivated communities of beneficial organisms that have evolved alongside us for thousands of years. They help break down food and make nutrients available for absorption." A senior medical officer who had joined them scoffed. "You expect us to believe that intentionally contaminated food could help? This is a medical crisis, not a cooking class." "Then let me prove it," Tom challenged. "Give me your worst cases, the ones who haven't responded to any other treatment." Dr. Gray hesitated and nodded. "At this point, we have nothing to lose." He led them to a quarantine section where the most critical patients lay. The first patient was the food critic who had once mocked Earth cuisine. Their scales had lost all color, and they could barely lift their head. Tom prepared a small amount of fermented broth, rich with beneficial bacteria. "This is beneath my dignity," the critic whispered, but took a small sip when Dr. Gray insisted. Tom set up similar treatments for 5 other critical patients, carefully documenting which fermented foods he used for each one. Then came the hard part: waiting. The first signs of improvement came within days. The food critic scales began to regain their shine. Other patients reported feeling stronger. Their bodies were finally absorbing nutrients again. Word spread through the station. More doctors came to observe, their initial skepticism fading as they saw the results. Tom worked with the medical staff, explaining the principles behind fermentation and the importance of maintaining living bacterial cultures. But how can something so basic be so effective? One young doctor asked, watching as Tom prepared another batch of treatment. "Because it's not basic at all," Tom replied. "Every culture on Earth developed fermentation techniques. They found ways to work with nature instead of trying to control it completely. These recipes are the result of thousands of years of observation and refinement." The success stories multiplied. Patients who had been at death's door began to recover. The medical staff started documenting everything, analyzing the bacterial strains in Tom's fermented foods. But not everyone was convinced. A group of traditional medical practitioners protested, calling it dangerous to return to primitive methods. They demanded more tests, more proof. Their protests were silenced when the food critic, now fully recovered, called a station-wide broadcast. "I once mocked Earth's cuisine," they announced, their scales now gleaming with health. "I called it primitive and dangerous. I was wrong. These foods don't just feed us, they support life itself." Dr. Gray organized an emergency medical conference. Representatives from affected worlds listened intently as Tom explained the role of beneficial bacteria in digestion. He showed them how different fermentation methods created different bacterial communities, each with its own benefits. "We thought we had perfected food processing," one medical expert admitted. "But in removing everything we thought was unnecessary, we also removed something vital." As the conference ended, Dr. Gray pulled Tom aside. "We need to spread this treatment throughout the galaxy," he said. "Will you help us?" Tom looked at his grandmother's old recipe book, thinking of all the generations of wisdom it contained. "Yes," he said. "It's time to teach the galaxy how to cook." In the weeks following the successful treatments on the Grand Meridian, research teams from across the galaxy descended on Earth. The main conference hall of the Global Food Research Center in Singapore buzzed with activity as scientists of all species gathered to understand how primitive Earth food had saved so many lives. Tom stood at the front of the hall, beside a large display showing microscopic images of bacterial cultures. Dr. Gray and Maria worked with him, explaining their findings to the assembled researchers. The plague wasn't really a disease at all, Maria explained, pointing to the data. It was the result of something missing. Something we took for granted. The holographic display showed two gut samples side by side. One, taken from a healthy human, teemed with diverse bacterial life. The other, from an affected alien patient, was almost sterile. For centuries, Dr. Gray added, advanced worlds have been perfecting food processing. We removed everything we thought was unnecessary. We created completely sterile, perfectly balanced nutrients. He paused, letting the implications sink in. And in doing so, we accidentally stripped away the very things that made those nutrients useful to our bodies. Tom stepped forward, holding up his grandmother's recipe book. Earth never reached that level of perfection in food processing. Instead, we maintained traditional methods that seemed primitive, but actually preserved crucial biological relationships that evolved over millions of years. The revelation hit the scientific community like a thunderbolt. Centuries of advancing in the wrong direction. All their progress in food science had actually made them more vulnerable. One alien scientist raised a hand-like appendage. But how did humans know to maintain these bacterial cultures? Your technology wasn't advanced enough to even see them until recently. Tom smiled. We didn't know. We just noticed what worked and passed that knowledge down through generations. Every culture on Earth developed fermentation techniques independently. They all found ways to work with nature instead of trying to control it completely. Maria pulled up new data on the display. Look at human history. Every time we've tried to over-purify our food or rely too heavily on processed nutrients, we've faced health crises. Our bodies evolved alongside these beneficial bacteria. We need them as much as they need us. The scientific teams began comparing notes. Similar patterns emerged from every affected world. The more advanced a society's food processing had become, the more vulnerable they were to the plague. Some worlds that had only partially modernized their food systems showed natural resistance. It's not just about the bacteria, Dr. Gray explained. It's about maintaining biological diversity. Earth's primitive methods preserve countless varieties of beneficial organisms. Each traditional recipe, each fermentation technique, maintained different bacterial communities. Tom demonstrated various fermentation methods, showing how different conditions encouraged different bacterial growth. The alien scientists watched in fascination as he packed cabbage for sauerkraut, explaining how the salt concentration created the perfect environment for beneficial bacteria, while preventing harmful ones from growing. This isn't primitive technology, one scientist realized aloud. This is incredibly sophisticated bioengineering, developed through millennia of trial and error. The implications went beyond just food. Worlds that had tried to completely control their environments, to sterilize and perfect everything, had inadvertently made themselves more fragile. Earth's messy approach had actually made humans more resilient. We've been looking at advancement all wrong, Dr. Gray concluded. True sophistication isn't about removing everything we don't understand. It's about working with the complexity of natural systems. As the conference ended, teams of scientists began planning how to reintroduce beneficial bacteria to their world's food systems. They would need to learn Earth's techniques, understand the principles behind fermentation, and adapt them for different species. Tom looked at his grandmother's recipe book, thinking about how its worn pages had helped save the galaxy. Sometimes the oldest wisdom was the deepest. Sometimes moving forward meant remembering what you knew all along. We should have known, he heard one alien scientist say to another as they left the hall. Any species that survived long enough to reach the stars must have figured out something important along the way. 6 months after the revelation about beneficial bacteria, The Grand Meridian Station looked very different. Where there had once been sterile food processing units, now rows of fermentation tanks bubbled with life. Tom walked through the new Earth Cuisine section, checking the progress of various bacterial cultures. "The kimchi batch is ready for distribution," he told his new assistant, a tall alien named Blue, who had once been a food processing engineer. "Remember, each world needs slightly different bacterial strains based on their biology." Blue made notes on a datapad. Like many station residents, they had originally been skeptical of Earth's methods. Now they wore a traditional Earth chef's coat with pride. The medical bay reports a 98% recovery rate among plague victims who followed the fermented food treatment program. The station had become the galaxy's first center for what they now called bioactive cuisine. Food that didn't just provide nutrients, but actively supported health through beneficial bacterial communities. Ships arrived daily from different worlds, their crews eager to learn Earth's techniques. In the main teaching kitchen, Tom watched as chefs from 20 different worlds learned the basics of fermentation. They carefully packed vegetables into jars, adding salt in precise measurements, just as his grandmother had taught him. "The salt creates a selective environment," he explained. "It allows the beneficial bacteria to thrive while preventing harmful ones from growing." This is a technique humans discovered thousands of years ago, long before we knew about bacteria. A screen on the wall showed similar scenes from across the galaxy. On hundreds of worlds, Earth chefs were teaching their techniques. Traditional recipes were being adapted for different species, creating new forms of beneficial foods. "Chef Tom," called a voice. He turned to see the food critic whose life he had saved. They had become one of the strongest advocates for Earth cuisine. "The Galactic Council wants to speak with you." In the council chamber, Tom stood before the same beings who had once rejected Earth's food as primitive, but their attitudes had completely changed. "Earth's culinary techniques have proven to be one of the most sophisticated biological technologies we've encountered," announced High Counselor Reed. "We propose establishing the Earth Culinary Institute as a central institution for the galaxy." The council's decision was unanimous. The Earth Culinary Institute would train chefs from all worlds in traditional fermentation techniques. Earth's recipes would be preserved as crucial medical knowledge. "But we must do more than just copy these techniques," Tom insisted. "Each world needs to rediscover its own traditional foods. Many of you must have had similar methods before modern food processing took over." His words sparked a galaxy-wide movement. Worlds began researching their ancient food preparation techniques, finding forgotten wisdom about working with natural processes instead of against them. Back in the station's restaurant section, Tom opened his own establishment, Earth's Heritage. The waiting list for tables stretched months long. Aliens who had once recoiled at the thought of fermented foods now savored dishes that their bodies recognized as deeply nourishing. "It's strange," Blue said one day, watching aliens from different worlds sharing a meal of traditionally prepared Earth foods. "We thought we were so advanced with our perfect nutrient processing. But real advancement wasn't about controlling everything. It was about understanding how to work with life itself." Tom nodded, thinking about how far they'd come. The plague had turned into a blessing in disguise, teaching the galaxy a crucial lesson about the dangers of oversimplifying complex natural systems. In his office, he kept his grandmother's recipe book in a special display case. Beside it stood his new title, Grand Master of Bioactive Cuisine. But he was most proud of the message he'd received from home. His grandmother's old fermentation recipes were now being taught in schools across Earth as part of basic survival training. "Sometimes the simplest things are the most important," he told his students, "and sometimes what looks like a step backward is really a leap forward." The galaxy had learned that progress didn't always mean making things more sterile or processed. Sometimes it meant remembering the wisdom that got you where you are. 5 years after the Great Galactic Plague, Earth had become the center of a culinary revolution that transformed society across the stars. Tom stood at the window of his office in the new Earth Culinary Institute headquarters, watching ships arrive from hundreds of worlds. The massive building, shaped like a traditional clay fermenting pot, had become one of the most important structures in the galaxy. Its laboratories studied beneficial bacteria, its kitchens taught ancient wisdom, and its halls welcomed students from every known species. "The latest reports are in," said Blue, now the Institute's head of research. They handed Tom a datapad showing statistics from across the galaxy. No new cases of nutrient absorption failure in 3 years. And worlds that have adopted Earth's dietary principles show improved health across all species. Tom smiled, remembering how far they'd come from the day Earth's cuisine had been rejected by the Galactic Council. Now that same council had just passed the Natural Food Preservation Act, requiring all worlds to maintain traditional fermentation techniques as essential medical knowledge. Chief Miller called a young human chef from the doorway. "The graduation ceremony is about to begin." In the Grand Hall, thousands of beings gathered to watch the latest class of certified bioactive cuisine chefs receive their credentials. The graduates represented over 50 different species, each trained in both Earth's traditional methods and their own world's rediscovered food wisdom. High Counselor Reed, once disgusted by Earth food, now stood proudly on stage to deliver the keynote speech. 5 years ago, we thought we had perfected food production. We were wrong. Earth showed us that true perfection lies not in controlling nature, but in working alongside it. Tom watched as each graduate received their certificate and their own copy of what had become known as the Galactic Food Codex, a collection of traditional recipes and fermentation techniques from every world. His grandmother's recipes formed the core of the first chapter. After the ceremony, Tom visited the Institute's museum. The simple clay pots and wooden barrels that had once seemed primitive to alien eyes now stood in places of honor, recognized as sophisticated bioreactors that had been perfected over thousands of years. "To think we almost lost this knowledge," said Dr. Gray, who had joined the celebration. He pointed to a display showing how different human cultures had independently developed fermentation techniques. Every traditional recipe contained wisdom we didn't even know we had. The museum's latest addition was a special exhibition, Earth's Culinary Heroes. It featured stories of the chefs, farmers, and families who had preserved traditional food preparation methods despite pressure to modernize. Tom's grandmother's recipe book held a place of honor. In the Institute's experimental gardens, plants from different worlds grew together. Scientists studied how various bacterial communities interacted, creating new and beneficial combinations. The garden's sign read, "The future grows from ancient roots." "We're receiving another delegation tomorrow," Blue mentioned, checking their schedule. "A newly discovered civilization. They want to learn about Earth's methods before they start modernizing their food systems." Tom nodded, pleased. The galaxy had learned its lesson. Progress didn't have to mean abandoning traditional wisdom. The most advanced worlds now maintained careful balances between modern technology and ancient techniques. That evening, Tom taught his favorite class, Basic Fermentation, to a group of young chefs. As he showed them how to pack cabbage into jars, just as his grandmother had shown him, he saw the same wonder in their eyes that he had felt as a child. "Remember," he told them, "every jar of fermented food contains billions of little helpers that keep us healthy. Our ancestors knew this, even if they didn't know why. Sometimes, the oldest ways are the best ways." Later, in his office, Tom added a final note to his own recipe book, one he would pass down to future generations. "The greatest advancement isn't in conquering nature, but in understanding how to be part of it. Never forget that in simplicity lies wisdom, and in tradition lies strength." The galaxy had entered a new era, one where Earth's primitive wisdom had become the foundation of modern health. And it all started with a simple jar of fermented cabbage, and the knowledge passed down from one generation to the next.